thank the Lexington Public Library for inviting me here, and I'm very appreciative that you've shown up to hear me. I'm here to talk about the second volume of my 4-volume series on the political life of Abraham Lincoln. I've been traveling around the country, learning a lot, talking to people, and hearing their questions. I'm going to speak for a while, and I'm going to give my full talk. The local public access station is going to record this. You can see their camera over there. And so I'd like everyone, whoever watches that station, to be able to hear what I have to say about Abraham Lincoln in my book. I want to tell you that the title of my book, and I'm glad to be in Lexington, I should say, which is, of course, the home of Henry Clay, Lincoln's beau ideal of a statesman, and Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's wife. Lincoln himself was here several times, and I'm going to talk about some of his visits here and the influence of Lexington and Kentucky on Lincoln in ways that I think people don't necessarily know about so much. The title of this book, Wrestling with His Angel, comes from the story of Jacob in the Bible. Jacob wrestled with an angel through a long night, as you remember, and in the dawn he had realized a new identity. And he assumed a new name. His name was Israel. That's the name he took. And for Lincoln, it was similar. He was like Jacob. He wrestled, but for years. And at the end, he assumed a new identity too. And I'll talk about that. It was a tough time for Lincoln. It's a decisive period in his life in which he becomes the man we know as Abraham Lincoln. So I know people in Kentucky are very interested in Lincoln. The more time I have spent with Lincoln, the more I've come to understand that his words and actions were the careful result of his intense self-discipline. The silences that his law partner, William Henry Herndon, and his friends described as his melancholy were also a mask for his concentration, intellectual absorption, and focus. His depression and his other feelings deepened his self-awareness and spurred his self-education, which informed his understanding of human nature and politics. Even when his life seemed to have been reduced to insignificance, he was scanning the horizons and interpreting its signs. Now, this book describes Lincoln's dark night of the soul, Lincoln coming to his revelation of a house divided, from which he emerged as the recognizable Lincoln of history. He would be that man until his assassination. After Abraham Lincoln's one term in the Congress and his return to his law office in Springfield, he stared into the distance for long periods of time. Herndon, his partner, recalled him breaking one of his silences with a cry of anguish. The political world was dead, Herndon wrote. Things were stagnant, and all hope for progress in the line of freedom seemed to be crushed out. Lincoln was speculating with me about the deadness of things and the despair which arose out of it, and deeply regretting that his human strength and power were limited by his nature to rouse and stir up the world. He said gloomily, despairingly, sadly, how hard it is to die and leave one's country no better than if one had never lived for it. The world is dead to hope, deaf to its own death struggle, made known by a universal cry, what is to be done? Is anything to be done? Who can do anything? And how is it to be done? Did you ever think of these things? Almost as soon as Lincoln came back to Springfield, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, turned him right around, and she sent him on a mission to her hometown, Lexington, Kentucky, to serve as co-counsel to recover the Todd family fortune, which was considerable. Lincoln found himself thrust into the vortex of his native state's politics turned into mortal combat between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. The lawsuit and the politics were intertwined. So bear with me and follow these threads. For nearly a decade, Mary's father, John S. Todd, Senator Henry Clay's business partner and political ally, had tried to wrest the Todd family estate from Robert Wycliffe, who was a wealthy and powerful man known as the Old Duke. He had married Polly Todd, a Todd cousin who held the estate but passed away. Wycliffe was also the political leader of the virulently pro-slavery movement. John Todd, running for the state senate against that movement, though he was a slaveholder himself, was demonized as an abolitionist. In the middle of the campaign, in July 1849, he died of cholera. Lincoln arrived to pursue the family's case in October, just in time to observe the pro-slavery movement rewrite the Kentucky state constitution to eliminate the law prohibiting the slave trade within its borders. Lincoln lost the case, the Todd family lost the estate to Wycliffe, and at the same moment that the political legacy of Henry Clay, Lincoln's early beau ideal of a statesman, and the legacy of Mary's beloved father was destroyed. All of it destroyed. If those events were not sufficiently embittering, there was another factor, a profound but concealed factor. From memoirs, journals, and pamphlets of the time, a mystery underlying the Todd heirs v. Wycliffe case emerges. It was the Todd family secret, and I bet they don't talk about it at the Todd family house down the street. There was, in fact, a living heir. He was Polly Todd's grandson, the only child of her son, who had died at a relatively young age. But this heir was not legally a person. He was, in fact, a slave. And he had been emancipated and shipped to Liberia. In 1878, years later, this former slave, the invisible man of the story, named Alfred Francis Russell, native of Lexington, was elected vice president of Liberia. And in 1883, he became president of Liberia. So he was Mary Todd's second relation to become a president. And he was the second Kentuckian to become a president. So back in Illinois, from Kentucky, Lincoln spoke with John Todd Stewart, his first law partner and early political mentor, a conservative old Whig. The time would soon come in which we must become Democrats or abolitionists, said Stewart, and Stewart would eventually join the Democrats. When that time comes, my mind is made up, Lincoln replied. The slavery question cannot be compromised. Stewart added that he spoke in an emphatic tone. Lincoln expressed to many of his friends his anger at the rising slave power he had observed in Kentucky. He was livid that an anti-slavery Whig lawyer from Lexington, he knew in Lexington, had been driven out of the state for his views. His name was Samuel F. Miller, and President Lincoln would appoint him to the Supreme Court. Lincoln described young, thoughtless, and giddy-headed Kentucky slaveholders with slaves trudging behind them, the most glittering, ostentatious, and displaying property in the world, because human beings were property. Lincoln would get excited on the question, said one of his friends, and believed that the tendency of the times was to make slavery universal. He told another friend, in a few years, we will be ready to accept the institution in Illinois, and the whole country will adopt it. The Todd Ayers case, with its hidden history, left Lincoln smoldering in private until he emerged years later. But the time for Lincoln to step forward had not come, not yet. A great revolution was required to bring Lincoln out of the wilderness. Lincoln's orbit in these years revolved around the 8th Judicial District of Central Illinois. Day after day with Judge David Davis and our coterie. The judge really ruled over all the lawyers, and they traveled from county courthouse to county courthouse like an entourage. I shall never forget the first time I saw Mr. Lincoln. We're called Leonard Swett, a criminal attorney who was one of Lincoln's closest colleagues and friends and would be instrumental in his political campaigns. Swett came to the town of Danville, Illinois, where Lincoln was trying cases. When I called at the hotel, it was after dark, and I was told that he was upstairs in Judge Davis's room. In the region where I had been brought up, the judge of the court was usually a man of more or less gravity, so that he could not be approached save with some degree of deference. I was not a little abashed, therefore, after I had climbed the unbanistered stairway, to find myself so near the presence and dignity of Judge Davis, in whose room I was told I could find Mr. Lincoln. In response to my timid knock, 2 voices responded almost simultaneously. Come in. Imagine my surprise when the door opened to find 2 men undressed, or rather dressed for bed, engaged in a lively battle with pillows, tossing them at each other's heads. One, a low, heavy-set man who leaned against the foot of the bed and puffed like a lizard, answered to the description of Judge Davis. The other was a man of tremendous stature. Compared to Davis, he looked as if he were 8 feet tall. He was encased in a long, indescribable garment, yellow as saffron, which reached to his heels, and from beneath which protruded 2 of the largest feet I had up to that time been in the habit of seeing. This immense shirt looked as if it had been literally carved out of the original bolt of flannel of which it was made, and the pieces joined together without reference to measurement or capacity. The only thing that kept it from slipping off the tall and angular frame it covered was the single button at the throat. And I confess to a succession of shudders when I thought of what might happen should that button, by any mischance, lose its hold. I cannot describe my sensations as this apparition, with modest announcement, "My name is Lincoln," strode across the room to shake my trembling hand. I will not say he reminded me of Satan, but he was certainly the ungodliest figure I had ever seen. Who was this Lincoln? A Lincoln engaged in pillow fights. Well, as I wrote in my first volume, A Self-Made Man, Lincoln was determined to leave his past behind, even to bury it, as if hiding his humiliation. His impulse was to protect himself from revelations about his origins. As for the actual details of his early existence, Lincoln was stone silent. It was at a campaign rally in 1856 that the man who had been extraordinarily reluctant about discussing his past, sensitive about his social inferiority, blurted out a startling confession. "I used to be a slave," said Lincoln. He did not explain what prompted him to make this incredible statement, why he branded himself as belonging to the most oppressed, stigmatized, and untouchable caste, far worse than being accused of being an abolitionist. Illinois, while it was a free state, was the most racist in the North and had a draconian black code. Why would Lincoln announce that he was a former slave? Well, the bare facts he did not disclose to his audience were these. Until he was 21 years old, Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln, had rented him out to neighbors. And the father collected the son's wages. Lincoln was, in effect, an indentured servant, a slave. He regarded his semi-literate father as domineering and himself without rights. Thomas Lincoln himself had led a harsh and unfair life. In Kentucky, where the family originally lived, he'd been forced to compete for wages with slaves, and his farm was taken away from him by a wealthy man who lived in Philadelphia and claimed the land and won it in a lawsuit. So Thomas Lincoln fled across the Ohio River to the free state of Indiana. He wanted his son to learn an honest trade as a laborer, perhaps to be trained as a carpenter like himself. And he considered formal education a waste of time. He considered reading, and we're in the library, to be a form of laziness. And he even hit Lincoln for reading. And he sought to suppress any larger ambition as useless dreaminess in his son. Lincoln spent only a few weeks in a frontier school and was entirely self-educated. He did it all himself. Now, Lincoln truly considered himself to have been held in bondage and escaped. His captivity as a boy, he felt, was humiliating and degrading, imprisonment in a world of neglect, poverty, fecklessness, and ignorance. But he had a stepmother who encouraged him to read, and he was lucky with that benevolent stepmother. But his sense of having been put down was at the root of his fierce desire to rise. If he was angry with his father, he also knew that his father had been reduced to a dirt farmer and compelled to flee slavery to escape from, to flee Kentucky in order to escape slavery. Slave states are places for poor white people to remove from, not to remove to, Lincoln would say. Lincoln had been oppressed by a man who himself was oppressed. His father had made his own escape. He didn't get very far up the social ladder, but he didn't leave Kentucky. Lincoln was a fugitive son and a fugitive himself. He believed he'd had his own fugitive experience and emancipated himself, largely through education. He was an oppressed and stunted boy who achieved his freedom. If with his disadvantages coming from the lowest class, he could do it, it could be done. Now, Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he was, as he insisted, naturally anti-slavery. His deepening understanding of slavery and its full complexity as a moral, political, and constitutional dilemma began in his childhood among the primitive Baptist anti-slavery dissidents in backwoods Kentucky and Indiana, whose churches his parents attended. And those were very unusual churches for the time. As a boy, Lincoln rode down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. He was the original Huck Finn. And there he discovered an open-air emporium of slaves on display that shocked him. On street corners, auction blocks of slaves. As a congressman, a one-term congressman, he lived in a boarding house that was informally known as Abolition House. He experienced the invasion of slave catchers coming to seize one of the waiters as a fugitive slave. Undoubtedly, he knew the secret of the house where he lived, that it was a station in the Underground Railroad. He denounced the Mexican War as fraudulently started and voted numerous times against the expansion of slavery in the Western territories and in the land that had been gained from Mexico. With the quiet assistance of the leading abolitionists in the Congress, he drafted a bill for emancipation in the District of Columbia, which never received even a single hearing in the House of Representatives, not one. And then he came home to an obscurity that seemed as though it would never end. At the lowest moment of political despair and retreat in American politics in his lifetime, marked by a widespread loss of faith in democracy itself, Lincoln emerged with his cause, because suddenly, in 1854, the once and future rivals of Lincoln combined to blow apart the cornerstone of civil and political peace. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, Lincoln's perennial rival, seeking a transforming gesture that would carry him to the Democratic presidential nomination in the White House, and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, heir to slaveholding wealth, and the de facto acting president of the United States operating behind the weakling, Franklin Pierce, converged in their collaboration on the KansasNebraska Act. That act repealed the Missouri Compromise that had forbidden slavery north of a line of latitude, north of which there couldn't be slavery, and it now made possible the extension of slavery to the Western territories. So in a stroke, the old political order cracked apart. "We were thunderstruck and stunned," said Lincoln, "and we reeled and fell in utter confusion," describing the atmosphere of the early resistance. "But we rose each fighting, grasping whatever he could first reach, a scythe, a pitchfork, a chopping axe, or a butcher's cleaver. We struck in the direction of the sound." Now, in two brief autobiographies, Lincoln depicted himself in this period as though he were content in a kind of internal exile, becoming nearly indifferent to politics, immersed in his legal practice. As he was contemplating his race for the presidency, he told the Chicago Tribune, in 1854, his profession had almost superseded the thought of politics in his mind, when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused him as he had never been before. It was about this decisive juncture in Lincoln's career that Herndon wrote of his partner's ambition. That man who thinks Lincoln calmly sat down and gathered his robes about him, waiting for the people to call him, has a very erroneous knowledge of Lincoln. He was always calculating and always planning ahead. His ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. Now, Lincoln clung to the hull of the sinking Whig Party. That's the party of Henry Clay, longer than some, but he also knew that a new coalition against the extension of slavery had to be organized. In this period of party chaos, the party's coming apart at the seams, Lincoln cast himself into the whirlwind. He sequestered himself in the library of the Illinois State Capitol, the Law Library, where he drafted his speech against the KansasNebraska Act. Stepping onto the podium to speak at the Illinois Hall of Representatives on October 4th, 1854, he never again left the stage of history. Lincoln, the defender of the Declaration of Independence and its precept that all men are created equal, invoked the blood of the Revolution, the American Revolution. He spoke of slavery as wrong, 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 and wrong. Lincoln, the Shakespearean, pointed to the moral wrong of slavery, like the bloody hand. And remember, Lincoln liked Macbeth as his best play. Out damn spot. It says, like the bloody hand, you may wash it, and wash it. The red witness of guilt still sticks and stares horribly at you. Now, in this chaotic period, there were many movements that raced across the landscape, that pro and anti-slavery, against immigrants, and against liquor. And the nativist and temperance movements confounded the development of the anti-slavery one. Anti-slavery Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs remembered their grudges against each other. They had been running against each other for a long time, and they still regarded each other with mutual suspicion. On the day that Lincoln gave that speech in the Illinois Hall of Representatives, a small group of abolitionists, radical abolitionists, came up to him afterwards. They came up to the podium, and they asked him if he would join them at a meeting of a group of themselves. And they had a name for their group. They called it the Republican Party. They understood that they needed a more effective political figure to help lead them. But Lincoln said he had a law case in another town, and he dodged them. He didn't want to go to the radical meeting of the Republicans. Well, John W. Bunn, who was a Springfield merchant and Whig partisan, who funded Lincoln's campaigns, and yes, there was campaign fundraising back then, judged Lincoln unique among politicians. Lincoln's entire career proves that it is quite possible for a man to be adroit and skillful and effective in politics without in any degree sacrificing moral principles. Little men tried to do the same things he did and make very bad work of it. They lack the high moral inspiration that animated Lincoln. Lincoln presents the most remarkable case in American history of a man who could be a practical politician and at the same time be a statesman in the highest sense of both terms. For years, Lincoln had turned over in his mind the menace of slavery to democracy until, in 1855, he had a vision of what was to come. I think that there is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us, he wrote his co-counsel in the Todd Ayers case, George Robertson, who was a Kentucky judge. The signal failure of Henry Clay, wrote Lincoln, and other good and great men in 1849 to effect anything in favor of gradual emancipation in Kentucky, together with 1,000 other signs, extinguishes that hope utterly. But there was another complicating factor that entered into the equation. It made it very difficult to organize an anti-slavery coalition. And between 1845 and 1854, more than 3 million immigrants came into the United States, the first great wave. 40% were poor Irish fleeing the potato famine. About 40% were Germans who were escaping from the failed liberal revolution of 1848. Now, conservative Protestants viewed the Irish as a source of crime, corruption, and poverty. And both the Irish and the Germans were beer drinkers, a habit that aroused temperance crusaders who condemned them as drunken, lazy, and, above all, sinful. So there was a new party that sprang up, and this party was called the Know-Nothing Party. The reason it was called Know-Nothings is that members were told, when they were asked if they belonged, to reply, "I know nothing." And it sprang from a small sect in New York City called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. If you see the movie The Gangs of New York, there's a lot about this in that movie. Within months after the 1852 election, the Know-Nothings attracted an estimated membership of more than 1 million. And here it had one platform plank. It was that only native-born Protestants could hold public office in the country. And it had a slogan, "Americans only shall govern America." So as the crisis deepened, Lincoln wondered, how could he be effective fighting slavery, maintain his identity in the Whig Party that was disintegrating beneath his feet, and deal with all these different movements that were growing up in which people hated each other? On August 24th, 1855, he wrote his intimate friend, Joshua Speed, a native Kentuckian with whom he had shared a room in Springfield and who was now presiding over his family's Kentucky plantation. They agreed on some things and they disagreed on others, including slavery. But in the forefront of Lincoln's thinking was the threat of the know-nothings. "I am not a know-nothing, that is certain," he wrote, Joshua Speed. "How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." Lincoln had a way with words. So state by state, this new Republican Party was being organized. And in Illinois, a new group came to Lincoln. They were a group of anti-slavery newspaper editors. And they invited him to join them as their leader at a meeting to organize a convention of the new party. Lincoln was absent at the time, recalled his partner, Herndon, and believing I knew what his feelings and judgment on the vital questions of the hour were, I took the liberty to sign his name to the call. So John T. Stewart, Lincoln's first law partner, ran into the office and tried to remove Lincoln's endorsement. He asked Herndon if Lincoln had signed the abolition call. This is what Herndon wrote. I answered in the negative, adding, I'd signed his name myself. To the question, did Lincoln authorize you to sign it? I returned an emphatic no. Then exclaimed the startled and indignant Stewart, you have ruined him. I thought I understood Lincoln thoroughly, wrote Herndon, but in order to vindicate myself, I immediately sat down after Stewart had rushed out of the office and wrote Lincoln, who was then in Tazewell County attending court, a brief account of what I had done and how much stir it was creating in the ranks of his conservative friends. If he approved or disapproved my course, I asked him to write or telegraph me at once. In a brief time came his answer. All right, go ahead. We'll meet you, radicals and all. At that meeting on February 22nd, 1856, which was George Washington's birthday, George Schneider, the editor of the German language newspaper Staatszeitung of Chicago, the biggest German language newspaper in Illinois, proposed a plan to denounce the know-nothings. Well, the nativists present strongly opposed it. The conference threatened to collapse. Schneider announced that he would submit his resolution to Lincoln and abide by his decision. Gentlemen, declared Lincoln, the resolution introduced by Mr. Schneider is nothing new. It is already contained in the Declaration of Independence, and you cannot form a new party on other principles. This declaration of Mr. Lincoln's, Schneider recalled, saved the resolution and, in fact, helped to establish the new party on the most liberal democratic basis. Lincoln's judgment made possible the creation of the Illinois Republican Party, which became the instrument that would, in 4 years, carry him to the Republican nomination for president. But he could not foresee that distant future, nor could he predict the shocking 10 days that shook the world that would soon polarize and clarify the conflict. Think about these 10 days. On May 19th, 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech in the Senate on the attack on democracy that he called the crime against Kansas. On May 21st, an army of nearly 1,000 pro-slavery Missourians, who were called the Border Ruffians, under a red banner inscribed Southern Rights, rampaged into the free state town of Lawrence, Kansas to ransack it, to drive out those who were against slavery, and claim Kansas as a slave state. The next day in the Senate, while Sumner sat quietly writing at his desk, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina came up to him and battered him relentlessly on his head with a gold-handled cane, nearly killing him. Blood streamed across the floor of the Senate. 2 days later, on May 24th, along Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, a radical abolitionist named John Brown and his followers hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death. And it was 5 days after that, on May 29th, that Abraham Lincoln stood on the platform of the founding convention of the Illinois Republican Party. And he had assumed a new identity. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was the transcendentalist philosopher, would declare his mind mastered the problem of the day, and as the problem grew, so did his comprehension of it. Rarely was a man so fitted to the event. Within 2 years of assuming his new identity as a Republican, Lincoln sounded his own note of destiny. Lincoln's language was drenched not only in Shakespeare, but also drawn, in this case, from 2 passages of the King James Bible. From the Gospel of Mark, if a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. From the Gospel of Luke, every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. On June 16th, 1856, declaring his candidacy for the Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln explained, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it." Now, remember, just a few years earlier, he was despairing and wondering, what can be done? Can anyone do anything? But now he had thought about it, and this is what he said. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He said, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. By now, Lincoln's sense of history and politics had become very sharp. 2 weeks after his defeat to Douglas, he wrote to his friend, "The fight must go on. The cause of civil liberty must not be surrendered at the end of 1 or even 100 defeats." In 1860, beginning his campaign for the Republican presidential nomination, in his speech at Cooper Union in New York City, Lincoln concluded, "Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." Now, Lincoln's political education was long, but many of the moments of Lincoln's awakening from his period of political slumber were not publicly known until years after his death. In early 1855, there was an incident that was not known until later. A free black woman named Polly appeared at the office of Lincoln and Herndon with a tale of woe. Her young son had hired himself out in a steamboat in the Mississippi, something like what Lincoln had done when he was a boy. But when he reached New Orleans without free papers proving he was not a slave, he was imprisoned and to be sold into slavery. So Lincoln appealed to the governor of Illinois, who was a Democrat and ally of Stephen A. Douglas, and he said he could do nothing. And Lincoln appealed to the governor of Louisiana, and he rejected Lincoln's appeal. So Lincoln and Herndon raised sufficient funds and located an agent in New Orleans to purchase the young man's liberty. Soon, his prison door swung open and he was returned to Springfield. Lincoln had bought a slave to free him. It was Lincoln's first act of emancipation. At about the same time, in early 1855, traveling the county court circuit, staying overnight in a boarding house, Lincoln's discussion with a former judge and fellow lawyer, T. Lyle Dickey, a conservative old Whig, went on deep into the night. Judge Dickey contended that slavery was an institution which the Constitution recognized and which could not be disturbed. Lincoln argued that ultimately slavery must become extinct, recalled another Illinois lawyer who was present. After a while, said Dickey, we went upstairs to bed. There were 2 beds in our room. And I remember that Lincoln sat up in his nightshirt on the edge of the bed arguing the point with me. At last, we went to sleep. Early in the morning, I woke up, and there was Lincoln sitting up in the bed. Dickey, said Lincoln, I tell you, this nation cannot exist half slave and half free. Oh, Lincoln, replied Dickey, go to sleep. Thank you very much, and I would be interested in any questions you might have, and I hope I have some answers. Any questions? Sir.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. It's also it's a pleasant circumstance to be here today and to enhance the history of Kentucky when our president is just right across the border in Ohio saying that he's the new Henry Clay. So thank you very much. But you can answer that question later. But my first question is, to what extent did poverty influence Lincoln's outlook on life? After he left from Hodgeville and went over to Illinois, I'm sure you've been there undoubtedly and seen the farm. But my impression of what I know is that it was a fairly substantial homestead, fairly wealthy, 100 pigs and other things, etc. I don't know how Thomas's wealth compared to the other settlers in the area, but subsequently in history, perhaps you can correct it, it seems as though you had kind of a frontier myth of there was poor, or poorer than he really was, and is that, to what extent is that true? To what extent, if it is true, do you think that it affected his view of poverty and things of that nature, if he indeed was not so poor?
Well, I think that Lincoln was very devoted to equality of opportunity for everyone, in great part because of the poverty that he had experienced and the neglect. His father, he had a complicated relationship with his father. His father lost every farm that he had and mismanaged it, and was also driven out of Kentucky as well. Felt he'd been driven out. And he was semi-literate, and Lincoln was embarrassed by his father's lack of education, even as he tried to prevent young Abe from getting educated himself. When Lincoln's mother died, Nancy Hanks, of what was called the milk disease, it's unpasteurized milk, Thomas Lincoln went to get another wife, went back to Kentucky, and came back with a new wife. But he left Lincoln and his older sister Sarah alone in the wilderness to care for themselves for months, these 2 children. And when the stepmother came, she regarded them as like wild animals. And she's the one who imposed order, and to whom Lincoln said he was eternally grateful because she made possible his education. But his feeling about becoming somebody was rooted in that experience. And he wanted to put that behind him. He wanted to rise as far as he could. He wanted to become educated. He became a lawyer. He married a socially prominent woman who herself was well educated. She had been educated in Lexington at a French-speaking academy, not far from Henry Clay's house. He rose in the world. And he wanted to extend, and it was not simply something that he wanted only for himself. He saw his own life story as something that should be open and available to every American, and should be the American story. That everybody should have the opportunity, and the obstacles of poverty should be removed so that all could rise. And that's what Lincoln meant by free labor, and why he always cited the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. So poverty was a strong element in his sensibility about himself and politics. Any more? Over there.
You mentioned in passing the Primitive Baptist anti-slavery group, and I thought that was very interesting. How important were these groups in Kentucky, and do we have any evidence that they affected Lincoln's ideas about slavery?
Well, Lincoln's parents, who really were not educated and could I don't even believe they could read and write. Lincoln said his father could blunderingly sign his name or make a mark. These churches existing in Kentucky were anti-slavery. They were called emancipationist churches. And they had itinerant preachers attached to them. I've done some research into this and followed this. And they went into Indiana, and the Lincoln family belonged to the churches and followed these preachers. And they would go to the churches in Indiana where they went. When Lincoln's mother died, he found the original preacher that they'd had in Kentucky and brought him back 6 months later to do a funeral service at the graveside in Indiana. Even though they were not educated, couldn't read, they were influenced by a preacher who was himself, even though he was an evangelical and he was also a free thinker. People had all kinds of ideas at the same time. And he was a reader of Tom Paine and a follower of Jefferson, and read all kinds of anti-slavery stuff early on in the early 1800s. And it existed in Kentucky. There was enough anti-slavery feeling, certainly, so that Henry Clay, certainly early on, was strongly anti-slavery in what he said. Lincoln, in his eulogy of Clay, unlike a lot of other people, pointed that out. Pointed out that element in Clay's early thought and quoted it. That was different from the Primitive Baptists. But it's always been there. And that's what Lincoln meant when he said naturally anti-slavery. He meant he got it naturally from his family. Over here.
Yeah, so what was his relationship like with Mary Todd? Was it a purely like functional type of marriage, or was there like some chemistry there? Like they get along?
That's a great question.
Yeah, thanks.
This was a really complicated relationship, and they had a lot of chemistry. Um, so here's Lincoln. This is what you have to think about. Lincoln is living in Springfield, and he is a very prominent politician, but he's very raw. And he's got frontier habits, and he doesn't know how to behave with, elegant manners around women. He doesn't know he's supposed to open the door or anything like that. And one woman turns him down because he seems uncouth to her. So he courts Mary Todd. Now, Mary Todd has been brought to Springfield from Lexington by her sister, who was married the son of the first territorial governor of Illinois, and he lives in the biggest mansion on what's called Aristocracy Hill in Springfield. So he's the most socially prominent person in the most socially prominent family in Springfield. And this sister brings one by one her younger sisters to Springfield to meet suitable men to marry. And Mary fixes her sights on this uncouth character. And the family doesn't really care for him as somebody who should be her husband because he seems socially inferior, and they call him a plebe. And Mary revolts against her family. Now, at first, Lincoln doesn't know how to deal with her. He doesn't know what he thinks, doesn't know his feelings, and he breaks up with her. But then they get back together. They're brought back together with friends. The whole story is in the first volume. It's a complicated story. It involves a duel that Lincoln doesn't fight, in which he's always embarrassed about, not because he didn't fight it, because he was engaged in it at all. And that came out of the fact that he and Mary had done some dirty political tricks in a newspaper, smearing one of Stephen A. Douglas's friends. And Lincoln was covering for Mary for what she'd written. So they decide after this they're going to elope, and because she's going to revolt against her family. And it was described, people who saw them together in sitting rooms said Lincoln was just completely fascinated with her. Here she is, she was educated, she could speak French, and she was very unusual among women of the day because she knew a lot about politics, because her father was political, he was close to Henry Clay. She grew up around Henry Clay, she spent time in that house. She knew a lot of political people, and she had opinions. Henry Clay called her a fiery little Whig when she was a girl. So it was very unusual for women to voice their political opinions in mixed company. Women weren't supposed to do that, and she did, and she didn't care. And she had a volatile personality, and Lincoln was bewitched by her. And Lincoln liked the idea of this woman having political views, and she was very ambitious politically and thought she could help make something of this raw material. She was, women may want to improve their men, but she really wanted to improve them. And so she told her sister she was going to get married on the very day of the wedding, and her sister threw a fit and said, "You cannot do this like this. We have to throw you a proper wedding, and we have to get the right minister, the important minister in town, and we have to have a party." And they threw together a wedding party on the same day in that mansion on Aristocracy Hill, and they were married. And it was a complicated marriage all the way through, but Mary Todd made possible Abraham Lincoln. Because remember, he's a man living there without a family, and she gives him a family. She gives him standing, and she is ambitious for him. And as ambitious as he is, sometimes he undervalued himself, but she would never let him do that. So it was a very important marriage. Right here.
To follow up just a little bit on the Mary Todd question, Mary Todd Lincoln, what were her personal views on slavery, and to what extent did she influence, if at all, Lincoln as he was going through this dark night of the soul that you describe in the book, and his own personal evolution of thought about the wrongness of slavery?
Well, Mary Todd was a partisan Whig, even more partisan than Lincoln, who was very partisan. She was also, although she never joined the Know-Nothings, she was something of a nativist. She had Irish help, and they lived in a back room on the second floor of their house, and she always had these maids, and she always had unkind things to say about them. And Lincoln took it all with a grain of salt. In 1856, the Republican Party ran its first candidate for president, John C. Fremont, a senator from California. Lincoln obviously supported the Republican Party and the candidate. He was even nominated for vice president, came in second at the convention. And it is likely that Mary Todd voted for what was called the American Party, which is what the Know-Nothings became, and voted for their candidate Millard Fillmore, who was an old Whig, the last Whig president. She still held on to all this Whig politics until her husband ran. But I don't think she influenced his social views on this. In the White House, it's an interesting story. I mean, she had an assistant and someone who dressed her named Elizabeth Keckley, who was a black woman who was also her confidant, who was always present, and wrote a very interesting memoir of life with the Lincolns. It's worth reading. So, I think Lincoln had a lot of forbearance. She had very harsh views of some people. She was very judgmental. More questions?
What are you looking forward to in the next book?
Thank you. The next book's Lincoln's going to be president.
So much is written about that. What do you see?
Well, this Lincoln, here he is. He's got to create these instruments of power at each moment to face just untold difficulties at each turn. I mean, the whole country comes apart. There's a civil war. The fate of the country depends on it. How's he going to handle that? The head of the military was against Lincoln. He installs a general in charge of the armies, and the guy's trying to undermine him the whole time. George B. McClellan. How does he deal with that? Everyone keeps losing battles. No one wants to fight. His early cabinet is a mess. No one can manage the War Department. He's got to find somebody. All along the way, Lincoln has to figure this out, every single piece of it. And at every turn, he is excoriated. He's, on the one hand, seen as a tyrant because he's trying to save the Union and using the army to do that, and he's doing all kinds of things people don't like when you have an army and you're fighting a war. On the other hand, he's seen as vacillating and weak and timid, because he's waiting for the right time. He's measuring things when politically emancipation might happen. Can happen at certain times, has to happen later. When he says, you know, he doesn't want to turn Kentucky into a state that leaves the Union and issue an Emancipation Proclamation too early. He says that would cause 50,000 bayonets to be turned against us and make the Union untenable. Preachers come to him and say, you've got to support emancipation. He says, I'd like to have God, but I must have Kentucky. So, you know, Lincoln has a lot of difficult decisions to make here. And I carry the next volume all the way up to Gettysburg. I hope so. I like being in Lexington. One more question, final question.
Now, we know that you're also a political commentarian, that you were close to Hillary Clinton and the results of her election, very close election. And now we have the election which you intimately followed with Donald Trump. Do you think that we are facing a challenge now, somewhat as challenging as Lincoln did when he became president, with the situation that we have in the United States now?
Well, there are a lot of challenges and lessons we can draw from Lincoln. Lincoln looked at the circumstances that he faced, and they were new circumstances. There was a new crisis of democracy. People had lost faith in democracy. Lincoln was influenced by a book in 1854 that was called Sociology for the South, The Failure of Free Society. And that book, by George Fitzhugh, a Southern writer, prominent writer, Virginian, said that democracy was not the way of the future, but was a bad form of government, and that the Declaration of Independence was wrong. All men are not created equal, nor should we think that. And this book said everything that Lincoln was against, and he used it as a text to refute. So there was a feeling of despair in the government. So he took these circumstances and this feeling of despair, he defined the new circumstances, he thought about it hard, and he spoke. He only had his words. I mean, he had a political network and so on, but he had ultimately it was just his words. And he was able to speak and arouse people, and it was through that of redefining where people were, what the circumstances was, and what the crisis was, that he became a leader. Now, I don't know if there's a Lincoln out there right now, but whoever it is if they emerge, is going to have to do something like what Lincoln did. And during the war, Lincoln says, we must think anew and act anew, and then we shall save our country. So that's, you know, that's what Lincoln did. And someone's going to have to do that. So maybe they can learn something from Lincoln, like all of us. So thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.